Thank you for listening to this download of Start the Week, presented by Tom Sutcliffe.
Hello, we're talking about strategic thinking this week. What Lawrence Freedman, Professor of War Studies at King's College London, doesn't know about this subject could be written on the back of a postage stamp. What he does know needs a lot more paper. He's just published Strategy, a panoramic 700-page history of mankind's long search for a reliable way to bend the future to its will. As a chess player, the journalist Dominic Lawson has an interest in move and counter-move too, and he'll soon be applying his strategic skills to a radio series in which he interviews well-known amateur players of the game while simultaneously trying to checkmate them. And David Runciman reflects on the strengths and weaknesses of democracies in crisis in his new book, The Confidence Trap. We start, though, with a case study of force projection and strategic failure, Shakespeare's Coriolanus, a new production of which is just about to open at the Donmar Warehouse in London, directed by that theatre's artistic director, Josie Rourke. Josie, it's hard to think of a Shakespeare play that better exemplifies some of the ideas and the dilemmas that we're talking about today. I'm sure that's not why you chose to do it. Why Coriolanus now?
No, not to offer Start the Week in Neat's proposition, but it's always fascinated me as a play, I think principally because of his character and what he's struggling to do against the world he's within. I think it's also a play about politics. A lot of people have said that it feels very contemporary or very modern in what's not actually a modern production. I can't help but thinking that if you make the play clear, it would be modern at any point, given that its themes about the emergence of democracy, someone who is a potential demagogue within that, the conflict between militarism and what the Roman people might want, are never irrelevant, it seems. Did
that provocative and disputed word pleb play any part in your thinking?
Well, we were
It's suddenly got a resonance that it didn't have a year ago.
It has, yeah. And one of the things that happens in the production is that Annona Plebis, which is corners our own price, is painted on the back wall of the theatre. So it's there without. I mean, I think that its definition at the point at which Shakespeare was using it, and its definition now has really changed. The word has moved and shifted, which doesn't mean that some of the debates around it, particularly the notion of what a patrician class is to a people, don't resonate.
Well, it's odd, actually, because now you look at it and you think the contempt has swerved in the other direction, that the people have more contempt for their masters than the other way round in some cases.
Yeah, I mean, I think it varies from society to society, doesn't it? It's quite... I think one of the things that one has to get one's head around when doing the play, and certainly this took up a lot of our first week of rehearsal, is an understanding that although Shakespeare is writing about early Rome, he's also writing about Jacobean London, and that it's, you know, and with the grain riots in the Midlands at that point, which sort of informed the beginning of the play to an extent, people think. There's another really interesting theory that it was his first sort of court theatre play. So it's one of the first indoor plays. So whereas one might imagine that it was done at the Globe with the groundlings and that big audience, actually it was probably for a more expensive audience, which is fascinating. I mean, it's really hard to see where Shakespeare comes down. You know, it's a play that's been both staged and shut down by fascist regimes within its history, and the incendiary nature of it, and certainly some of the incendiary discussions in the bar after just a few previews are totally
you're right that it's ambiguous, but it's not terribly ambiguous about the tribunes of the people, is it? I mean, they come off pretty badly, it seems to me, in the play.
Well, I disagree with you, I think, because, you know, it's got this sort of Jacobean plot where they contrive to bring Coriolanus down, but it's not a very heavy contrivance. All they need to do is set him on enough that his pride swells and he speaks his mind in a completely inappropriate context. I think there's a better question for me around that, which is how, and actually it's not a very good question for strategy, which is how much he actually wants to and feels that he should be a politician, or want to be consul, which is what his family and his friends are pushing for through the first 3 acts of the play. What he really wants to do is get back on the battlefield and fight his celebrated rival. He's more of a soldier than he is a politician.
I thought he was a very interesting performance. So you've got Tom Hiddleston playing him. Much the mildest, gentlest Coriolanus. I mean, has all the arrogance and the fierceness, but there's a vulnerability about him which makes the ending of the play much more poignant than I've ever seen it before, it seems to me.
That's interesting. I'm pleased that you say that because, you know, he certainly to slightly misquote the play, hits the first three acts of it like a planet. You know, the rage that he comes on stage with, and the contempt, and all of those things that people necessarily associate with Coriolanus are there. But then the second half of the play, I think, has to yield a tragedy. And seeing as is the only named character who dies within it, it sort of has to be his, doesn't it?
It has to be. As I thought he'd captured very much that fear that some very successful people have of praise, not because they have contempt for the people giving it, but because praise then sets up expectations, and that there's an element of that in him too, that he's fearful of what he's being required to do. Yeah,
and this is a young Coriolanus in this production who, through this extraordinary act of heroism, is driven into consulship at a very early age. You know, it's clearly an ambition that other people have for him. How much he holds that for himself, I don't know. And I think that, you know, there are other things going on within it. When you talk about you know, what one thinks about the tribunes necessarily, there's also just this sense of Roman society within Shakespeare's play that's completely obsessed with this athletic body of a soldier. You know, it's a play that famously talks about the stomach, talks about the body, talks about his wounds. This sense that in order to be successful, he has to show himself to the people and show them his wounds is something for which he has, although consul after consul has done it before him, perhaps a reasonable anxiety.
Lawrence Freedman, I want to bring you in because it was extraordinary watching the play after reading your book, because he seems to perfectly exemplify this battle between two kinds of approach to war or to combat. In your book, you write about the difference between BA and metis, which are the cunning and brute force. And Coriolanus is all brute force, isn't he?
Indeed he is, but and this tension between force and guile is one that Shakespeare obviously picked up a lot, and partly getting it from Machiavelli as well. So it goes back to the Jacobean as well as the classical sense of these two different approaches. Do you get what you want through just being more powerful, tougher than everybody else, or because you're not as powerful and tough, having to find ways of being cunning and crafty to deceive your opponents, which is the sort of thing that the noble warrior is not supposed to like.
Yeah, I was very interested in your book, the definition of plot, and when that came into the language as something that was negative, and the distinction between having a plot and having a plan. Yeah. And when the tribunes march into the Senate and say he's overturned, that the election is overturned and that the people don't want him for consul, one of the first things Coriolanus says is that this is a plot, and the Tribune immediately says, call it not a plot, it's the people.
Yes. I mean, it goes back to Guy Fawkes, basically.
But Coriolanus also has that sense that it is dishonourable to go by indirection, doesn't it? Volumnia, his mother, has to read him a lecture on how it is not, in fact, dishonourable to kind of get your way with soft words at one point.
Yeah, I'm interested in Lawrence's point about brute force versus cunning, because, of course, this is the modern battle in the strategy of chess, because the computer is brute force, and indeed technically it is called brute force. It is just massive transistorization, exhaustive machine-like calculation, whereas we humans are not so good at that, not nearly, but we do have cunning. We do have cunning, and of course now brute force has beaten cunning. But still, it is, they're almost two different approaches to the same thing. And the human, of course, is much more interesting, and Shakespeare could write about that. Brute force is not very interesting.
Well, it's rather... David Runciman, you write a little bit about the way in which we slowly change, you know, from this idea that guile and statecraft is somehow dishonourable to it becoming a great virtue. And sort of one of the democratic virtues. Is
yeah, absolutely. And I think all democracies are conflicted in the way that this story brings out, in that they want things from their leaders, including brute force, actually, that democratic peoples are attracted to leaders who have some of the qualities that then democracy is designed to rein in. And that conflict goes on all the time. And in all ways, on both sides of the divide, the conflict runs through modern democracy.
I think one of the tensions in it is that it's often being very crafty, or even using brute force is a great thing to do on your opponents, but not a very good thing to do with your own people. And that one of the reasons Odysseus, who sort of introduces this idea in Homer or exemplifies it, he's very clever with the Trojans, but nobody actually believes him when he's talking to their own people.
And I've always found one of the haunting moments in the play when he uses brute force on his people, when he banishes them. They banish him, and he says, I banish you. And all democratic politicians must have a moment where they wish on election night, when they've been rejected, they can say, well, I reject you. But, of course, they can't, because they're politicians.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, this is very clearly a soldier in the Senate, and what makes him a great soldier, which is that there is no gap between thought and action. And you know, through rehearsals, we're saying actually he's much more like a star striker than he is a team captain. In that sense, you know, he's the guy you send out just to score the goals that you need. You know, he's not the general of the army.
But it's interesting, isn't it? Because the moment at which he bursts through the gates in Corrali, it's an insane act. It's not the act of a sane soldier. It is suicidal. And that moment of shock is presumably part of the reason that he carries it off, is that his opponents can't believe he's actually done it. Yeah, which is and strategies of shock and surprise and deception are the things you can probably only do once. I mean, it's a shock the first time they do it, but if he tries to do it again, they'll be ready for him. And that's one of the problems of the trickster, is that when people have sussed you out, you can't carry on doing that way. I think the other thing about Coriolanus, and I guess you could say with Othello as well, and is this sharp dichotomy between the traits considered necessary to be the successful general, the successful military leader, and those considered necessary to be the successful politician. Whereas now you would say the modern general has to be pretty political, not only in his ability to work his way through the government and the alliances that they have to be part of, but also the situations which they're trying to interpret are very complex and require the clear political understanding to do that. Well, you write about this in your book. It's been seems compulsory to use the word magisterial in all the reviews I've read so far, and I can understand what they mean because you cover everything. You cover from evolutionary theory to the telling of stories in themselves. And your starting point is the spread of this word strategy, the fact that everybody wants to have one, everybody claims to have one, even the smallest council in the country. Now, you're trying to kind of restrict the definition back a little bit. What's your
Well, I'm trying to do two things, I think, but partly what's a useful way of using the word, but also that it isn't a magic ingredient that'll solve all your problems. The people... it's an easy thing to say to a government or to the head of an organisation, what you really need is a strategy, as if that's going to make everything coherent and give you a way forward in a way that you just haven't been able to see it before. Whereas in practice, strategy is an attempt to solve the problems that you face, and you may face a number of problems at once, and the way forward may not be clear. Your main problem may just be surviving, not creating a better situation. So it's partly to limit it, so it's a useful thing, but it is also just to warn that it's an important thing to have, but a very difficult thing to do.
A strategy isn't just a long-term plan, though, is it? There's more to it than that. You have to have some sense of conflict, some sense of an opponent.
Well, it's not even a plan. I mean, the basic line is it's not a plan. I mean, it may have planning as part of it to implement it, but the point about a plan is that you can follow a sequence of events to your eventual goal, whereas the point about strategy is conflict, that you're dealing with other willful beings who've got their own ideas, their own agendas, and it's the interaction with them, which, of course, is one of the links with chess, is that you're having to anticipate what others might do, as well as just press on with your own ideas. So, you know, the line with which the book opens from Mike Tyson, which seems to have attracted as much attention as anything else in the book, is everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the throat.
Yeah, it's a great epigraph. I mean, it's a version of that very famous
Herman von Moltke. No plan survives contact with the enemy.
Much livelier, yeah. There's a sort of self-deception at the heart of a lot of strategy, isn't there? I mean, that's one of the interesting things you write about, that it is a very seductive idea, and this maybe explains why it has spread so wide, is that we like to think that we can control the future.
I think we're clever strategists, and I think it goes back to the earlier discussion about guile and cunning. It's one of the reasons for the popularity of Sun Tzu, the Chinese writer, who's all for deception and surprise, is it pays to a conceit that we can be cleverer. We can win just by being cleverer than everybody else. And the stupid lumbering enemy won't understand what we're doing, which is fine if you're fighting a computer, but if you're fighting somebody else who's also read Sun Tzu, you can have a problem because you can neutralise each other's moves quite easily. And that seems to have happened quite a lot in China as well in the past. So it's a nice idea that just by outthinking our opponents, we can always neutralise, negate their advantages in resources and raw power.
One of your shortest and pithiest definitions of it is about creating power. It's an act of leverage, isn't it? Essentially, a good strategy.
Yeah, I mean, if you think that we go into most conflicts with sort of a pot of power, and if we're fighting somebody or dealing with somebody who's got more of it than ours, the good strategy is one that helps you bridge that gap. It adds to your pot of power. And that, if it succeeds, but if it's not so good, it can subtract from it as well.
Your book, the beginning of the book, 250 pages, is about what I suppose you'd conventionally think of as strategy, Clausewitz and Liddell Hart, and the way in which battles were fought. But the huge bulk of the book is about strategy from below, which is revolutions, and strategy from above, which is management. Is it our admiration for military men? Why is it that military men set the tone for the way in which we solve our problems?
Well, the word strategy comes from the art of the general, so that's why. And it was introduced in a military context, but it was soon, I think, found useful in other contexts. And politically, amongst revolutionaries, were always trying to work out strategies, and they probably talk more about strategies than everybody else because the gap between what they've got and where they're trying to get to is so large. So they have to think about it a lot, and then they have big arguments about strategy. I think one of the interesting things now is that most writing on strategy is in business. And the relationship between a business strategy and a military strategy, I don't think is that great in terms of what we were saying before, in terms of a modern military strategy has to be very politically astute. You'd argue that's true with a modern business strategy. But when business strategists tend to look at military, it's about being very macho and decisive and following the leadership lessons of Napoleon or Alexander the Great or something, and often gets them into trouble as a result.
Well, that's one of the interesting things about the book, isn't it? That no strategy will persist forever, because you either come up against a situation like the invention of the atomic bomb, which utterly changes all of the rules that are applied to this particular game, and then suddenly we get into game theory as well. That was very interesting, I thought, that they, at the moment of gravest danger, we come on to the notion of playing a game, and that's what gets us out of trouble.
It's a way of dealing with the horror in an abstract sort of way. That if you actually try to think about moves involving nuclear weapons in a sort of sensible, reasonable, rational way, you're paralysed. But if you put them in a 2x2 matrix and you call it prisoner's dilemma or a game of chicken or something like that, you can then start to think through what it actually could mean, come up with some counterintuitive ideas, which actually, if you look back at people like Tom Schelling, were quite productive. I mean, they came to useful and sensible conclusions, partly about the impossibility of winning a nuclear war through this means. So although others came to more dangerous conclusions. But it can be quite a productive way of thinking. But it was a way of dealing with the horror without actually talking about the horror all the time.
And is that the moment at which strategy really breaks out into the world of commerce? Because you've got these clever, brilliant men at the Rand Corporation and various other places, and brilliant mathematicians applying their minds to this.
I think game theory actually was probably much more influential outside of the military arena than it was within. It's probably exaggerated the role it played within, but outside it influenced economics and business strategy considerably.
David Runciman, I mean, your texts overlap in a large number of cases in this. You write about Schelling as well.
I do, and about politics as poker. One of the things I found so fascinating about Lawrence's book is there's a temptation in politics to take the military route, but also the other temptation, the sort of technocratic route, which is to think that the best strategy is to be insulated from conflict and to keep it kind of pure. And you bring out the full range of dangers of that, because you've got to keep testing it. The classic idea is leadership from the front, running up against conflicting wills. And there is a temptation in contemporary politics, I think, to try and withdraw And that's the danger of technocracy.
And I think also one of the attractions of game theory, economic theory, was that here was a social science route to provide the right answers to our policy problems that got away from mucky politics. And as you say, the need to test it and to actually see whose interests are going to be affected by particular moves.
I think the Rand Corporation, many American wars were based on their planning, which were not good, and I think that the planning is hugely overestimated. I mean, it's sometimes said about in chess, it's better to have a bad plan than no plan at all. This is completely wrong. It's much better to have no plan at all, and I think that. The idea, I know that, for example, if your opponent plays a bad move, which you don't understand it, and you think there may be a plan behind it you don't understand, actually it may mean that it's a very bad plan, and that a bad move is actually the introduction to a worse move, and after that it's an introduction to a still worse move. And planning, I think, is the great disaster in many ways, because improvisation is the key.
You quote Eisenhower, don't you, who has a rather brilliant formulation.
That plans are useless, planning's essential. That it's necessary to think through, but I don't think... what you say is true. It's much harder to get into the mind of your opponents, who are often from different cultures, different backgrounds, and therefore you're more likely to make mistakes by trying to overread them. And one of the hardest things, even for an intelligence agency, is when your opponent is being stupid, because you never actually believe that's what's happening.
Exactly.
And that's one of the advantages democracies have, that sometimes they're extremely stupid and it throws off their more clear-sighted enemies.
You write very interestingly at the end of the book about narrative. I mean, literally about Hollywood scripts and the way a script and a narrative is drawn up. I thought that, I was sitting in Coriolanus thinking, that's exactly what this story is about. It's a man trapped by a narrative which was useful up to a certain point and has then enclosed him completely.
I think that's right. And it's interesting just to be looking at this material while I'm directly in production for Coriolanus, because the aspect that doesn't necessarily appear is a kind of deep aspect of psychology, where you go, he's a man who's been driven by the death of his father, the desire of his mother to have him achieve, the family group that he's within, which is his improvised family. And actually his behaviour is much more... he has no strategy, Coriolanus. That's why he goes into Coriolis on his own. That's why the minute someone does something remotely irritating to him, he flies off the handle. He's utterly unstrategic.
Well, he has none of that ability to think 4 moves ahead, does he? He's living in the instant all the time. I'm going to turn to you, Dominic Lawson, because you're very much concerned with the ability to think 4 or 5 or 6, maybe even more moves ahead. You're going to be presenting a series called Across the Board, which is conversations conducted while you actually play chess. Now, that obviously limits your interviewee pool to people who play chess. Is there something psychologically that connects amateur chess players? Are they a certain type of people?
Well, it's competitive, so they're competitive people. No one plays chess except to win, and you have to really enjoy it. And someone once said that chess was a sort of conflict between the pain of thinking and the pain of losing. And you have to absorb a lot of pain in thinking, because it is painful to think hard, I think. But winning is so pleasurable to you, you're prepared to go through this pain. And so, yes. And also, I think there is, to me at least, and many others, there is an aesthetic to chess. It's highly geometric. And I think it's very hard to be keen on chess unless, at some level, it appeals to you just as pure beauty as art. I mean, it's possible not to, but I've never met a keen chess player, man or woman, who doesn't get a certain frisson from what he or she sees as a beautiful move.
There's a chicken and egg question here, isn't there? I mean, 2 of your interviews, you're interviewing Rachel Reeves, a politician, Lennox Lewis as well, the boxer. Does their interest in chess and their playing of chess make them a better politician and a better boxer, or are they bringing those qualities to the chessboard? Well,
I think Lennox Lewis, certainly, it informed his boxing. And, of course, the boxing is like a chessboard. It's a ring. And just as in chess, you have to control the centre of the board, either directly or indirectly. So you have to control the centre of the ring. You have to cut off the options. You get them into a corner. In chess, you're hunting the king. You're putting the king into a corner. And I think Lennox Lewis, to the frustration of many of his managers who wanted him to be a bit more more brute force, and
Mike Tyson.
but actually, I asked him in the interview about Tyson, and you mentioned Tyson, his sort of violent interpretation, and actually Lennox said Tyson was very easy to box because he only came forward. You knew before the game, before the match, he wasn't going to go left, he wasn't going to go right, he wasn't going to retreat, he was just going to come at you. And it's very easy, in fact, if you're intelligent, to prepare. You just know. So you think, well, okay, I know what he's going to do. And I can prepare for that. And much of chess, actually, nowadays, what you see on the board is a tiny amount of the work, tiny amount. The preparation is enormous. And, of course, boxing, I think, certainly, that goes on for months, the preparation. The actual bout can be over in 30 seconds, very easily. And you don't see that sometimes when you play chess. And certainly with Rachel Reeves, she struck me as she's a very, very thoughtful woman, immensely hard-working. Everything is very considered. I mean, she is, in some ways, a classical chess player, and very competitive.
You're obviously competitive. You play at a county level yourself. You had an edge here, didn't you? You could always throw in a curveball question at a critical moment. Did you do that to win at any point?
Mercilessly. Yes, of course. And in fact, Rachel would complain. I mustn't steal too much, but she I think got quite annoyed at this and said, "Oh, this isn't fair." Yes, but on the other hand, I had to write down all the moves, and I had to think up responses to because it's a dialogue. It's not just question, answer, question. There's a flow to it. So, yeah, we were participating in a chess struggle and a verbal struggle.
You said earlier that you talked of the beauty of the chessboard, and a lot of chess players do that. What does it say about it, though, that it's one of the only higher-order human activities that a computer can prevail at? Computers write very dull novels. They write very, very boring music, though they can do it. But a computer can play.
I mean, that may not always be the case. Because the development is so astonishingly rapid, and Moore's law shows that the thing sort of develops at an astonishing rate. So I could see, in fact, a computer writing a wonderful novel. If we knew it was a computer, we might be less interested in it. That's the trick, and this is the whole Turing thing of, well, do you know it's a computer?
Well, I was going to bring in Turing, because essentially a computer can now pass the Turing test as long as chess is the language.
Yes, which only means I think the Turing test is not a proper test, because actually we know it isn't, quotes, thinking. So I think it may refute the test. But yeah, Turing was one of the earliest chess programmers.
Josie Rourke, I mean, you've had experience in this field only because you produced a play about exactly this subject.
My previous project, The Machine by Matt Sharman, was about Kasparov playing Deep Blue, and actually my next project, Privacy, which is about some of the issues around Snowden and whether or not anyone can be private in the modern world. I'm in this kind of place where, having looked at all this material for The Machine and thinking about artificial intelligence, we're at a unique point in the history of data whereby it's possible to collect all this information about ourselves and for computers to process it so it can be stored and it can be processed and read. And, Tesco Club Card knows when you're getting divorced. The artificial intelligence
it knows you're pregnant before you do. Yeah,
absolutely. We're at a kind of tipping point where human behaviour can be inferred from its patterns, and that comes out of thinking strategically ahead, and a lot of that early computing that went on around chess and around AI, I think.
It brings us back to this question of whether, you're a political columnist as well, you've been fascinated by politics. Is chess a good model for politics?
No.
Not
at all.
And why not?
Well, politics is a team game. It's about massive organisations with millions of voters. Chess is intensely solitary. It's very hermetic, and I think there is.
And also, everybody knows everything all the time. Both players.
Yes, it is. There is perfect information. Nothing is hidden. On the other hand, because of its sheer complexity, that only takes you so far. And you're never, in certain positions, you can be absolutely certain, but a lot of the time you're in a sort of a cloud of unknowing, and you think you see a way through it, but you don't actually know.
Do you feel intuition yourself? I was reading something about scientists doing neural tests on grandmasters, and they found that grandmasters recognise a chess game like people recognise faces. Amateur players have to number crunch it. Yeah. Grandmasters have a sort of sense and intuition.
Fundamentally, it is all about pattern recognition. That's what it is. And you do that instantly. It's based on enormous study, but then it becomes intuitive. And there was a very good book written last year, which was considered the best chess book of the year, by a Dutch master called Hendricks, which was called Move First, Think Later. And actually it was a brilliant book, because that is what happens. I mean, generally with grandmasters, the very first move that occurs to them instantly is in about 99% of the case the right move. And Capablanca, who I think was probably the greatest chess player of all time, used to say, well, very often he said, I think only one move ahead, it just happens to be the right move. So it is very intuitive, and I think that's where we're totally different from machines.
But the intuition is a very... and it's what you get through experience, having read a lot, having looked at how other people do it. It isn't just a sort of a random thing. It's very well informed intuition.
Yes, it's not magic, is it? It's come out of a...
That's right, but when the move occurs to you, it occurs to you in a sort of nanosecond. It's not a deliberative process.
This is the sort of System 1 and System 2 thinking of Kahneman. The first move, the intuitive move, is the one that's actually got far more processing in it than the more deliberative moves that come where you have to really dredge it up from your brain.
Yeah. David Runciman, you write in your book at one point, not being able to play chess gave the democracies an unseen edge. You're talking, I think, about the Cold War.
Yeah.
What did you mean by that?
Well, in the Cold War, there was this endless debate about whether it's a game of chess or whether it's a game of poker. Although in the end, various people concluded following Schelling it was a game of chicken, and that was where the democracies had the advantage, because in the game of chicken it really helps that the other side can't read you and the erratic quality of democratic life. But the real fear was if it's a game of chess, the Russians are going to win. Poker's the American game. American presidents play poker, so that should be an advantage. But democracies can't bluff, because too much is out in the open. And there was a real fear, particularly in the early 60s, the period I wrote about, which is, if it's a game of chess we're going to lose, if it's a game of poker we're going to lose. Luckily, it was a game of politics, and that's neither chess nor poker.
Well, luckily, though it sounds bizarre to say it, both sides realised that nobody could win. You know, that if you've got atomic weapons going off, everybody loses.
And there was a deep human element to the interaction, and it's that crucial human element. I mean, again, going back to what we were talking about, the thought of a computer playing politics is a pretty terrifying thought, precisely for the reason that you can't be sure that the signals will be read, and it's absolutely crucial.
Of course, the scariest war game and movies like that are all based on the idea that a computer has taken over because they're the only ones who can be trusted.
And it's following a purely rational strategy to destruction.
But in David's book, he has a very interesting chapter on the Cuban Missile Crisis, and of course, Khrushchev was actually bluffing. So he was a bad poker player, but he was also a bad chess player, because the missiles on Cuba were like a passed pawn that has become detached from the rest of your forces, which is a grade A blunder. So he was neither a good chess player nor a good poker player.
And he put them there because his bluff had been called.
Did he know, though? I mean, one of the startling things in that chapter, David Runciman, is that at this moment of huge crisis for the world, Kennedy was worrying about the midterm elections. And he was thinking, well, what I do next is going to affect my results in the midterm election. Now, it's terrifying. The key to your book, isn't it?
In a way, it's the key feature of democracies is they always lack a sense of perspective. And in many ways, it looks like a hideous disadvantage. But in other ways, the constraint of that gives them the ability to act in ways. I say that Khrushchev, in some senses, suffered from the tyranny of choice. Kennedy, I think, deliberately boxed himself in. One of the things that he did was he went public, which he didn't need to do, and lots of the high strategists were telling him this is a back scenes game you should be playing. He went public, he brought in not just American opinion but world opinion. It constrained him, it toughened him. He was a genius at the game of politics.
But it also, that constraint then made things more difficult for Khrushchev, because Khrushchev knew he was constrained to a certain point.
I don't disagree, but I think the congressional elections were critical to the whole, to Khrushchev's strategy as well, because Khrushchev's idea was that he was going to announce these things after the November elections, when he thought that Kennedy would be then able to do the deal on Berlin that he wanted him to do. So, and the reason that Kennedy was so cross with Khrushchev was because Kennedy had spoken publicly that he didn't think Khrushchev was going to do this. So you can't detach it from the politics of American democracy at the time.
I want to come back to your book, The Confidence Trap, because essentially it's about a paradox, isn't it, that democracies seem to be quite good at surviving crises, but the crises keep on coming.
They do.
And we can't be sure that they will always survive them. So could you just explain a little bit the central thesis?
Yeah, in a way, the confidence trap is simply that for democracy to work, you have to have confidence in it. And one reason you have to have confidence in it is at any given moment, it often looks like it's not working. And if you look, as I've done at the history of the last 100 years, you can always find someone, even in the good years, saying this thing doesn't work. Because there's chaos on the surface, there's partisanship, there's mess. So you've got to believe in it in the long run. But believing in something in the long run constrains the way you think. And in a way, it relates to the point about narrative in Lawrence's book, that you can then evolve a kind of narrative which says we'll always get out of whatever mess we get into because we've got this long history of muddling our way out of crises. And at some point, you're going to encounter the crisis that doesn't fit that pattern. We haven't encountered it yet. It would be crazy to think the next 100 years will follow this neat pattern of stumbling into crises and muddling our way out of them.
You focus specifically on 7 specific crises. I mean, things like the end of the First World War and, a moment at which democracy genuinely thought it was in trouble because it couldn't apply pressure in the way the German autocracy could.
Yeah.
How did they get out? I mean, what was the advantage that democracy gave them in the end?
I think the advantage was adaptability. Tocqueville has this great line, which is democracies make more mistakes and they correct more mistakes. That is, they don't get
more fires get started, more fires get put out.
The autocracies might make fewer mistakes because they have the advantage of decisiveness. They can corral their forces, but when they make a mistake, they tend to get stuck with it, and that's the crucial difference. In the First World War, you saw it. People forget. In 1918, there was real panic on the Western side in the United States, London and Paris. People thought Paris was going to fall. And it turned around very quickly. It seems, in retrospect, that the democracies adapted their way out of the mistakes they made during the First World War. But what I suggest in the book is then what you get is the moment of truth where people think, democracy's won. We can seize our moment. We can create a world safe for democracy. They keep adapting. So they stumble their way out of their mistakes. They stumble their way out of their victories, too.
Another of the problems here, isn't it, as well, is that we've moved from an area of kind of a time of sovereign states and national politics to international politics. And because electorates don't overlap, it's very difficult for democratic politicians to make any larger scale solution.
Yeah, the seizing of the moment is harder than ever. And you see in democracies now, as you have over the last 100 years, this sense among democratic electorates that their politicians don't feel like they're up to the task because they're so obsessed with what the electorate is thinking they can't reach out. International politics complicates and confuses the picture, but it also creates those kind of conflicts which forces the democratic politicians to look outside of the box occasionally. So democracies do still have that underlying adaptability. It's not a story of disaster by any means, but it's getting more complicated.
What makes you think we're at a watershed moment now? Is it just that we've got away with it for this long and it can't carry on?
We've got away with it this long, but 100 years, again, is not a long time. When you take the big view, the grand view, 100 years into Athenian democracy, it looked okay because it was, as scholars now say, the most adaptable system in the ancient world. 200 years in, it was over.
I mean, I think it all follows from science. I mean, Darwinism is not the survival of the strongest; it's the survival of the most adaptive. In business, that is certainly the case. That the businesses, huge, mighty businesses collapse because they're insufficiently adaptive. The reason why Jobs and Apple were so successful is he would destroy his darlings. They would scrap a product even when it was still selling, go to another one. That constant energy which democracy has, I think it fits in with what we understand about evolutionary success, which is why democracies, I think, are evolutionary. They're adaptive in evolutionary terms, and that is why they last.
But because it's a human activity in which people also tell themselves stories about their own adaptability, there are real pitfalls and traps, which is to have that faith that adaptability will win out in politics can produce a kind of blinkered approach where you don't look far enough, you don't look over the horizon, because you assume you will adapt your way through. And there must be a risk that the belief in the adaptability of democracies is actually a fatal flaw.
But contrast it, say, with China, where you have the belief in strategy, the plan, and you have the one-child policy, which has been a colossal disaster, and which they still are finding incredibly difficult to get away from, even though all their economists are saying to them, this is insane, but no, this is the plan.
I mean, there's actually debate going on at the moment about China's air defence zone. Is this clever strategy? Or is it a major miscalculation? It's very hard to tell at the moment as to whether they really understood what they were doing, because the main thing they've achieved so far is put every other country in the region in connection with each other to form alliances that wouldn't necessarily have been there before. But maybe they're just being very patient and assume that by asserting their control over this area, it'll work out in the end. So there's often you can only see in retrospect whether a view was really clever long-term strategy of move or actually was just a series of sort of random responses that turned out well in the end.
You quote Kenneth Arrow, an economist who won a Nobel Prize, for suggesting that democracies were inherently unstable. Now, presumably you don't believe that. I mean, Dominic Lawson, you don't believe democracies are inherently unstable, do you?
Well, no, because you have a pressure valve, which is elections. The problem with non-democracies is it can be absolutely fine, but how do you have a change of government without massive bloodshed? This has been the problem in Syria. You know, it's not on a day-to-day basis that democracy is better. It's how does the transfer of power actually happen? And we can now see globally how lethal it is when there isn't some kind of agreed means of transferring power.
And one of the reasons I quote Arrow was he said that back in the 50s, and it was pointed out to him in the 2000s that democracy was doing fine, and he said it's only 50 years. The instability is just getting going. But I do agree, when you take these long views, democracies are facing some very, very serious challenges. But over the next 100 years, the thought that Chinese technocratic state capitalism is not going to make at least one mistake that it can't get out of would also be extremely wishful, I think.
There's this very interesting thing as well about the temptation to go for autocracy. Wonderful chapter where you write about George Bernard Shaw and John Maynard Keynes looking with certain wistfulness towards Mussolini's Italy.
Absolutely.
That's clearly a danger that we face now as well.
It's a perennial feature. Putin is the example now. We look at him, we see him stripped to the waist and hunting wildlife, and we think, well, our politicians aren't like that. Democracies always have that pull towards the thing they can't have, which is the macho, hard-man politician who's going to get stuff done. Yeah. But it's a fatal temptation.
Where Coriolanus comes in again.
Yeah, this unbelievably passionate argument by Coriolanus, during the course of which he mars his fortune in Act 3, where he says, purpose so barred it follows nothing is done to purpose, in reference to the idea that there might be some form of democratic representation. It was very, very hard for us, rehearsing that play, to imagine that there had not been such a thing as Western liberal democracy when Shakespeare was writing it, or indeed in Rome.
I'm going to have to stop you there because we're run out of time, I'm afraid. Thank you to all of my guests. Josie Rourke's production of Coriolanus is on at the Donmar Warehouse until February, and there's a National Theatre Live cinema showing at the end of January. David Runciman's The Confidence Trap and Lawrence Freedman's Strategy are both out now. Dominic Lawson's series of chess interviews across the board starts on BBC Radio 4 on the 30th of December at 1:45. We'll find out then when there are one. Next week, Andrew Marr talks to the writer Clive James. But for now, thank you and goodbye.
There's more information about Start the Week on the programme's website. Go to bbc.co.uk, where you'll also find many more Radio 4 programmes you can download for free.
The theatre, so it's there without. I mean, I think that its definition at the point at which Shakespeare was using it, and its definition now has really changed. The word has moved and shifted, which doesn't mean that some of the debates around it, particularly the notion of what a patrician class is to a people, don't resonate.
Well, it's odd, actually, because now you look at it and you think the contempt has swerved in the other direction, that the people have more contempt for their masters than the other way round in some cases.
Yeah, I mean, I think it varies from society to society, doesn't it? It's quite... I think one of the things that one has to get one's head around when doing the play, and certainly this took up a lot of our first week of rehearsal, is an understanding that although Shakespeare is writing about early Rome, he's also writing about Jacobean London, and that it's, you know, and with the grain riots in the Midlands at that point, which sort of informed the beginning of the play to an extent, people think. You know, there's another really interesting theory that it was his first sort of court theatre play. So it's one of the first indoor plays. So whereas one might imagine that it was done at the Globe with the groundlings and that big audience, actually it was probably for a more...
It's hard to think of a Shakespeare play that better exemplifies some of the ideas and the dilemmas that we're talking about today. I'm sure that's not why you chose to do it. Why Coriolanus now?
No, not to offer Start the Week a neat proposition, but it's always fascinated me as a play, I think principally because of his character and what he's struggling to do against the world he's within. I think it's also a play about politics. A lot of people have said that it feels very contemporary or very modern in what's not actually a modern production. I can't help but thinking that if you make the play clear it would be modern at any point, given that its themes about the emergence of democracy, someone who is a potential demagogue within that, the conflict between militarism and what the Roman people might want, are never irrelevant, it seems.
Did that provocative and disputed word pleb play any part in your thinking?
Well, we were
It's suddenly got a resonance that it didn't have a year ago.
It has, yeah. And one of the things that happens in the production is that Annona Plebis, which is corn at our own price, is painted on the back wall of expensive audience, which is fascinating. I mean, it's really hard to see where Shakespeare comes down. You know, it's a play that's been both staged and shut down by fascist regimes within its history, and the incendiary nature of it, and certainly some of the incendiary discussions in the bar after just a few previews are totally engrossing.
You're right that it's ambiguous, but it's not terribly ambiguous about the tribunes of the people, is it? I mean, they come off pretty badly, it seems to me, in the play.
Well, I disagree with you, I think, because, you know, it's got this sort of Jacobean plot where they contrive to bring Coriolanus down, but it's not a very heavy contrivance. All they need to do is set him on enough that his pride swells and he speaks his mind in a completely inappropriate context. I think there's a better question for me around that, which is how, and actually it's not a very good question for strategy, which is how much he actually wants to and feels that he should be a politician or want to be consul, which is what his family and his friends are pushing for through the first 3 acts of the play. What he really wants to do is get back on.
Thank you for listening to this download of Start the Week, presented by Tom Sutcliffe.
Hello, we're talking about strategic thinking this week. What Lawrence Freedman, Professor of War Studies at King's College London, doesn't know about this subject could be written on the back of a postage stamp. What he does know needs a lot more paper. He's just published Strategy, a panoramic 700-page history of mankind's long search for a reliable way to bend the future to its will. As a chess player, the journalist Dominic Lawson has an interest in move and counter-move too, and he'll soon be applying his strategic skills to a radio series in which he interviews well-known amateur players of the game while simultaneously trying to checkmate them. And David Runciman reflects on the strengths and weaknesses of democracies in crisis in his new book, The Confidence Trap. We start, though, with a case study of force projection and strategic failure, Shakespeare's Coriolanus, a new production of which is just about to open at the Donmar Warehouse in London, directed by that theatre's artistic director, Josie Rourke.
On the battlefield and fight his celebrated rival. He's more of a soldier than he is a politician.
I thought he was a very interesting performance. So you've got Tom Hiddleston playing him. Much the mildest, gentlest Coriolanus. I mean, has all the arrogance and the fierceness, but there's a vulnerability about him which makes the ending of the play much more poignant than I've ever seen it before, it seems to me.
That's interesting. Yeah, I'm pleased that you say that because, you know, he certainly, to slightly misquote the play, hits the first 3 acts of it like a planet. You know, the rage that he comes on stage with and the contempt and all of those things that people necessarily associate with Coriolanus are there. But then the second half of the play, I think, has to yield a tragedy. And seeing as it's the only named character who dies within it, it sort of has to be his, doesn't it?
It has to be. As I thought he'd captured very much that fear that some very successful people have of praise, not because they have contempt for the people giving it, but because praise then sets up expectations. And that there's an element of that in him too, that he's fearful of what he's being